Hey, what is going on guys? RvzStealth here, and in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the best top laners for patch 7.3. So as always, we're going to start off with the tier 1 champions here, and the first champion in the tier 1 for this patch is going to be Maokai. So Maokai right now is probably your best champion, or your best champion that you can play in the top lane if you want to play a tank, and if your team does need a tank. After Poppy getting nerfed a few patches ago, Maokai and Nautilus are now like the two premier tanks in the top lane, and Maokai, he's just a very super easy, very effective tank champion that you can play. He has a lot of crowd control in his kit. His Q, his W, and his E all provide good CC. He's one of the best peel top lane champions too. Like a lot of the top lane champions, they're more engaged type champions and they want to try to get onto the back line. But right now in this meta, we're seeing a lot of champions that just want to try to assassinate your AD carry. For example, someone like a Talon or a Zed or someone like a Yasuo. Maokai's great against those champions because of his targeted route. If the enemy does try to jump on his AD carry, he just presses W on them and he's able to peel for his team just really nicely because of that. The damage you can output with Maokai is actually really insane too. You can build basically full tank Maokai and you can still end up dealing like most damage in the game, which is really insane. So for when you should not pick Maokai, in the laning phase I would try to avoid matchups of Fiora and Swain. Those are two matchups that Maokai does tend to struggle with, especially against Fiora. If it does get past like the 30-minute point, you're really not going to be able to do too much to deal with the Fiora split push. And then I would look to pick him against any dive champion in general right now. And for the laning phase, he can do well against like Camille, Kennen, or Poppy, or just any champion that does want to try to get onto your backline in those team fights. Now next up here is going to be a bit of a surprise to a few of you guys, but it's going to be Talon in the top lane. So Talon right now is very underrated. He's a great pick in both the mid lane and in the top lane. The reason he's a great pick in the top lane right now is because he destroys a lot of meta matchups. I feel like a lot of people don't realize how strong Talon's early game actually is now. In matchups like Fiora and Nasus in the top lane, Talon can destroy the early game because of his level 2 damage. If you don't know how the new Talon works, basically once you do end up getting 3 abilities off on the opponent, then your next auto attack is going to bleed them for like an insane amount of damage, and your Q also does crit as well. So the damage from your passive as well as your Q in the early game just makes your all-in at level 2 really crazy, and you can definitely surprise a lot of top lane players just with how much damage you're going to be able to do. Now the lethality buffs also help him out a lot right now. Any lethality champion in this patch, they're all doing really well, and Talon is definitely no exception. And then it is also very easy for Talon to one-shot squishies once it does reach the mid to late game, and once he does get a few items, you can just stealth in with your ultimate as Talon. The enemy can't place a pink ward down now to see you in your ultimate, so there's really not much they can do from stopping you at assassinating the enemy AD carry. And then for when you should not pick Talon, look to pick him against Fiora, Nasus, and Riven. You can do well in a lot of these matchups right now in the top lane and in a lot of melee matchups. You just do have to try to take advantage of his level 2 all-in and his level 2 damage, because if you don't, then once it does reach like level 6, for example, if you're up against a Riven, then you could end up losing an all-in. But generally, if you can be aggressive in the early game, then you can win practically any matchup in the top lane. Two matchups that he does tend to struggle with in the top lane are Wukong and Quinn, so I would avoid those if you can. And then also I would not pick him if your team does lack team fight. That is one of the major cons to picking Talon in the top lane, is that your wave clear is really bad, your team fight is also not that great, unless of course you can get ahead. He's not like a Maokai though, to where if you fall behind with Talon, you're going to be pretty useless, whereas with Maokai, you're still going to be useful even if you do fall behind. Next up here is going to be another lethality user, and it's going to be Pantheon. So Pantheon, I think he's just a little bit of a better version of Talon right now for the top lane. He is a little bit easier to play. His poke damage is very strong for the laning phase. He does great in almost any matchup right now in the top lane, and he's one of the only top laners that can actually kind of deal with Jace in the laning phase. I've actually been picking Pantheon into Jace a little bit recently, and I have been able to win that matchup a lot of the time. You can just poke poke Jace down with your Q, and because of your passive, you do negate a lot of Jace's damage, like from his auto attacks. He's not really going to be able to get a lot of poke off on you in the laning phase from his autos, so I would look to pick him against Jace if you are a good Pantheon player. He does have great snowball potential too. His roaming potential is one of the best for any top laner with his ultimate, so if you do get ahead with Pantheon, always be looking to roam with your ultimate. Don't just leave lane though if you're losing lane or something, or if you're getting shoved in. Only roam like if you're winning lane. If you take the enemy's tower, then that's a great time to roam as Pantheon. He can also take Ignite, which just makes his early game super strong. With his ultimate, there's really no point in taking teleport on Pantheon unless you're in like a super hard matchup or something. Then I would take Ignite in most situations. And then for when you should not pick Pantheon, there really isn't a matchup that I would try to avoid as Pantheon. It more comes down to like your team comp and what your team comp needs. If you are lacking team fight like super heavily, then I wouldn't pick him in that situation. But if you do need some damage, or if you are in a very favorable matchup, then I'd pick him in that situation. Next up here is going to be another great tank right now in the top lane, being Nautilus. So Nautilus, I'd say he's a little bit better than Maokai. I prefer Nautilus over Maokai in the top lane right now, just because Nautilus does have a little bit more versatility when it comes to like looking for picks and being a playmaker. Whereas with Maokai, you can only really look for plays whenever your flash is up, because he doesn't have that hard engage like a Nautilus does with his hook or with his ultimate. So I would prioritize Nautilus a little bit over Maokai if you do need a tank. Now Courage right now and his W just make him super strong, especially in mid to late game team fights. He's just very hard to kill if he does get that Courage proc off, and once you do stack HP as Nautilus, your shield from your W just becomes insane. He's also a massive CC tank champion. It's just so hard to like position well against Nautilus in team fights, because if you walk up and you're playing AD carry, then he can just ult you, he can flash auto you, Q you, and you're pretty much dead from there on out if you are playing AD carry. And he's also great at setting up ganks in the laning phase with his flash auto or with his Q. So I would recommend, like, if your jungler is playing a strong early game jungler, or if your jungler just does want to gank top early game, then the chances of you picking up first blood or picking up a kill is very high. And then for when you should not pick Nautilus, I would try to avoid range matchups, and then I would also try to avoid Darius, because with Darius, what he wants to do is he wants to auto you to get that true damage off from his ultimate. And with Nautilus, since you are melee, then you can't really do too much in that matchup. And then to round out the tier 1s for this patch is going to be Jace. Now Jace did just get nerfed this patch, so I know a few of you guys are going to comment down below asking why he's in the tier 1 still, and I will explain here as to why he is still a great pick. So what Jace got nerfed this patch, or what they did to Jace, is they nerfed the damage from his Q in hammer form. They increased the mana on his E in hammer form, and they also decreased the damage of his all-in combo. When you switch from your ranged form to your melee form, then the auto after you switch also got decreased a little bit. Now all of that damage there is from your all-in combo. They did not nerf any of Jace's poke damage, and they also didn't nerf like his pushing power, so his early game is still going to be super strong. He's still going to be a very strong lane bully top laner. So if you're still able to win lane as Jace and you're still lane dominant, if you can get ahead of your opponent and you can get a few items up on your opponent, say you're like 2-0 and the enemy's 0-2, then that extra little bit of damage that you're losing is really not gonna matter. Like the all-in combo and the amount of damage that you can do as Jace already is super good, so losing that bit of damage is not going to affect him right now in this patch. Now he is one of the best top laners because he's lane dominant. His lane pressure is super good and his tower pushing is really good, which makes it very easy for you to get that first blood tower as Jace. His sieging potential is some of the best for any top laner too, so if you get ahead with Jace, then just look to group, look to siege down towers, because you take them super fast with your W, and you can also chunk the enemies. Like a squishy target is going to get chunked below half HP with your QE combo. Now for when you should not pick Jace right now, if he is not banned, I would look to pick him in most situations. If you want to be really safe, then try to avoid Malphite and Braum because they can do really well. For example, Braum, he can block your poke damage if you do try to siege, and then Malphite, he definitely outscales you once it does reach the mid to late game because he just stacks armor against you, he ults you in a team fight, and you can't really do too much. So with the tier 1 champions out of the way now, let's take a look at a few other strong picks that are a little bit weaker than the tier 1, but are still very strong if you can play them. Now these champions are going to be Fiora, Swain, Wukong, and Kled. Now these champions are in like a tier 1.5 right now. They're weaker than the tier 1 champions because, for example, Fiora, she gets crapped on in lane by Pantheon and Talon, but in most other matchups right now, she can do pretty well, and she can definitely be a very strong carry top laner. For Wukong, he's great with the lethality right now as well. I think that Kled is one of the most underrated top laners. The only losing matchups right now that Kled has is to like Quinn and to like one other top laner. Most other matchups he can actually win, so if you're a good Kled player, then he's a pretty strong pick in my opinion in this patch. And then for Swain, he pretty much outtrades any other top laner. He's great in most melee matchups, and it's just very easy for you to zone the opponent in the laning phase, like with your Q, with your E, and you also scale great into the mid to late game. And then lastly, for the tier 2 champions in this patch, there are quite a few pretty viable champions here in the tier 2. Now these champions obviously aren't as strong as the tier 1 or the 1.5, but if you can play these champions pretty well and you know your matchups with these champions, then they can still do pretty good in this patch. So these are going to be Riven, Gangplank, Kayle, Camille, Sion, Malphite, Darius, Quinn, and Aurelia. Now the one champion I want to take a look at here is Camille. Now for Camille in this patch, she did actually get pretty heavily nerfed, more so for solo queue than for the competitive scene, but right now in this patch, she's getting crapped on by Darius, Swain, Fiora, Wukong, Singed, Aurelia. There's just a lot of top laners right now that can actually do pretty well against Camille, so unless you do actually like really know what you're doing on the champion, I don't think she is really ban worthy in this patch. She still can be a pretty good threat if you're confident on the champion and you know what you're doing, but I don't think she's like a pick or ban status like she was in previous patches. So that is going to be all for this video, guys. If you did enjoy, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you have yet to already. So thanks for watching, have an awesome day, and I will see you in my next video.